Hey guys, what is going on? RedMaster here, and welcome back to another episode of Cards and Castles, where today it is, of course, time for another Meta Monthly. Now, I haven't done one of these in a while because I feel like for, at least the past couple of months, between the last one and this one, we've seen, of course, changes in, the way the meta has developed, but not to a point where I felt like it was important to make content for it. However, where we are now, I feel like is a pretty good time to make one. Just to kind of give you guys a little bit more insight as to what's been showing up more recently on the ladder, and maybe some tricks to combat them or what makes them strong, etc., etc., etc. So, with that being said, I want to move into the first deck in this Meta Monthly. Now, again, before we jump into that, these are, of course, just my opinions regarding the meta. If you guys have some different thoughts or, ideas on what could be, the strongest decks in your opinion, leave them down in the comment section below. Hopefully we can get a discussion started in there and see maybe if some other people are thinking differently than I am. And, of course, that is fine. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our first deck. Now, in my opinion, the first deck, or at least sort of our number 3 deck, if that maybe can make more sense, is going to be the Pirate Crusader Greed decks. Of course, School by that point. Now, in my opinion, School is still a very strong fallback, and of course, we've seen a lot of it in the forms of, or at least taking different forms, maybe. That's probably a better term. With things like the Drymoth deck still being prevalent, or just the classic sort of ramping School and bringing out a lot of big units, not necessarily including Drymoth in there. Or, not even just School, but sort of Pirate Crusader ramp in general. That's still very prevalent. But the reason they've fallen, in my opinion, of course, I believe the last one, they were at sort of like a number 1 slot. This time they place at sort of like the number 3. In my opinion, they've fallen due to the emergence of the other two that have sort of taken a more prominent position in sort of the metagame, and how they are able to just put a hard stop on Greed. And I'm not going to kind of give away the other 2 decks, but essentially what I'm talking about in this regard is that, well, sort of a spoiler here, both decks include the Warlock faction, or at least both the decks that I believe have taken more of a prominence include Warlock. And with the, I guess, prevalence of burn in these Warlock decks, they are able to put hard stops onto one of Greed's biggest engines or biggest support cards in the form of School, and with that, they usually tend to fall pretty quickly, running out of resources or not being able to bring out their bigger units early on. Or at least maybe more appropriately, I guess in that scenario, it would be more of it would cut off their supply to resources. Now, of course, what makes School very difficult to deal with is that if you let School hang around too much or stick around too much, they are going to be able to build up their forces very quickly and have an endless supply of bigger units to send down the face, which a normal deck, or at least a different deck, may not be able to keep up with. Now, I'm not saying that Greed is completely, blown out of the water by the other 2 decks. It's just that usually, more often than not, the other 2 decks do tend to come out on top of Greed. Most of the time. I'm not saying all the time. There are still moments that you might have a bad Greed matchup, and of course that ends up, causing all sorts of problems. But in my opinion, I think Greed has certainly fallen. They are still not a bad deck by any stretch of the imagination. They still hold a lot of power in the form of Craxus, as you can see on your screen there, providing a lot more draw, not to mention the School and Gold Gain provide, or at least the Gold Gain draw combo that is the School of Knowledge. That is still very prevalent, and if you can't really get rid of that, then you're going to be dealing with a lot of cards from your opponent. So, in my head, I should say, Greed's still a very good deck to go upon, to rely on if maybe you don't have other options. But as you'll see here, the other 2 decks on this list have kind of taken more of a spotlight and more of a priority, where I think they dominate this deck. Not only by the fact that you can burn off the school with Warlock, but with that you kind of cut off the tempo of Greed, and Greed starts to slow down to the point where the other two decks kind of can just still play their game and just kind of walk right over the Greed deck because they're not able to kind of keep up. So with that being said, Greed deck placing it at number 3 on this edition. Let's go ahead and jump into our next deck though, and start getting into some new territory, if you will. And next up on our Meta Monthly list is going to be the Warlock Crusader decks. Now, there are quite a variety of them to talk about, so of course, I'm not going to refer to like an individual one. Things like Last Will, Knights, good stuff, good burn, if you will. Those kind of all fit the category of red-yellow that have been kind of emerging as of lately, and they have certainly taken a tremendous leap in establishing their presence on the in the metagame. In my opinion, that's probably due to the fact that we saw an increase in range units recently. Things like Wizard, Darkbender, all becoming more prevalent, and honestly, the Pirate Viking deck I do slightly, or at least Pirate Viking decks I do attribute to more of like the rise of red yellow. Sort of like red yellow in my head was the answer to the emerging, Pirate Viking decks that we saw. With things like Hovel, Temple, things like that. People wanted to carry the Flamestorms and the Dragonfire for that massive burn. And meanwhile, they found out that, they can get a lot of other things behind that. Things like Arbiter Return for the healing, cracks that we mentioned, a while ago back in Greed. Those are also prevalent in these decks, and that they do lead to some crazy things. But anyway, going ahead with the Warlock Crusader, they've continued to make, in my head, they continue to remain prevalent solely based on the idea that, well, maybe not solely based on, I'm kind of just spitting out words here. But of course, their burn's another, probably a strong factor in there. And we've kind of seen that not a lot of other decks can really stop that kind of burn power. And when you throw other things in there like Knights, Last Will, those all have been seeing great levels of success recently, and they all fit like that red-yellow mold. So it kind of just makes sense that they all kind of collectively form like this red-yellow. I wouldn't say trinity because there's more than 3, but you kind of get what I'm saying here. They've definitely taken a gigantic leap in again in terms of establishing their presence. Things like heals, burns, strong units like Craxus, all those things. Just again, really attribute to their success. I know I feel like I'm kind of talking, the same points here, but honestly, I'm trying to think of other points, but that's kind of it. That really is my opinion of why I think some of these decks, or at least why the red yellows are so prevalent. Although there is kind of one thing that I'm leaving off that I do want to mention for our last deck. So kind of as a transition into that, I feel like this is a good place to leave off on red yellow. Again, a super dominant deck, one that has been just kind of dominating as of lately in a variety of different forms, and one that I think won't slow down for at least a little while before we see something new enter the fold. But with that being said, I do want to hop into our last deck for this video, so let's go ahead and jump in to our number 1 deck. Alright, and our final deck for this edition of Meta Monthly is going to be the Awakening decks. Now, I can already hear some of you guys telling me in the future, Red, why did you go with Awakening when, Red-Yellow has seen a lot more success? It's a lot more powerful than, the Purple Warlock Awakening. And I do prompt that is true. We've seen Red-Yellow come out on top over Awakening, but I put Awakening in my number 1 spot for 2 reasons. One, there has been a very large increase in the amount of Awakening decks we've seen recently. For some reason there's been a lot more of them, so quantity-wise, they've certainly kind of, in my opinion, maybe peaked just a little bit above the red-yellow. But as a second point, there is also a red-yellow Awakening deck. So, yeah. You guys have probably already caught on when I was alluding to it back in the last entry. But having a red-yellow Awakening deck kind of is like this weird middle ground between red-yellow and Awakening. And honestly, Red Yellow Awakening, if you guys haven't seen a couple of videos that we've done here on the channel about that deck, I highly recommend that you go and watch it because it's a deck that's able to do so much, and to kind of put it with the other red yellows that are still successful, yes, but not to the extent, in my opinion, of the Red Yellow Awakening. eh, I choose to kind of classify the Red Yellow Awakening as part of the overall Awakening archetype. So again, kind of going back, combining the 2 points, I do think that it slightly goes above the Red Yellow decks, or at least the Red Yellow subgroup, if you will, in this sort of meta monthly, because one, we've seen just a tremendous uptake of just an abundant, and they're everywhere. They're nearly everywhere, Awakening decks, which is weird. It's just, there's a lot of them. And two, the fact that you have a Red Yellow Awakening that's probably more dominant than the entirety of the Red Yellow subgroup, just kind of, to me, is just that exclamation point that Awakening is going to be sort of our number one, at least for a little while, before something faster kind of takes over. Because honestly, when people ask, like, what's the best counter to Awakening, you kind of really just have to be quick about it with your deck. You kind of just really have to put pressure on them. And we've actually, I believe in our last ranked with Red, we were up against an Awakening match, and we kind of just dominated that because we kind of quickly moved in and just asserted our dominant, like, we asserted pressure immediately right from the get-go, and we kind of never let up. And once more decks kind of start to incorporate that faster tempo, I feel like we'll probably see less Awakening because those faster decks will just completely override them. But for now, we just see this domination of not only the purple Warlock Awakening, which is not as powerful, but I do think in the coming weeks we are going to see maybe more of the red yellow when people start to realize, more of the benefits. Because you still get all the benefits of running red yellow. You got the burns, you got the heals, you got Craxus. But then combine that with Awakening, where you have things like a deflecting golem, you've got Headwood burn. It's just two kind of sets of factors combined to make this one ultimate deck, in my opinion. That's pretty tough to beat if it's not kind of rushed at quickly. I mean, that's kind of, or at least something happens during the game where you cut off a major point of the Awakening. Maybe you sliced off a Headwood or a Golem early on, and then your opponent is left stumbling until they find another tool to use. But I mean, most of the time, decks are going to have a hard time combating that because they usually can't get to the key parts of an Awakening deck fast enough before those things start to awaken and reawaken into just these monstrosities, whether they're just super golems or having multiple Headwoods proc and burn the entire board. So, yeah, I mean, and here, we'll just kind of quickly look at this one because we do have it here, and it's, again, like I mentioned, you got the Headwood, for multiple burns here. You got the Craxus. You've got the healing in terms of hands. You got all these aspects, which I think when you merge them together inside this Red Yellow Awakening, that kind of establish itself kind of separately away from the Red Yellow subgroup. I think it just makes the Awakening archetype our strongest meta option in this format, in my opinion, just because of how much is sort of inside and how much potential it has in terms of, maybe not like diversity is not the right word, but I'm saying like gameplay wise. There's a lot that you can do inside of a matchup and not be super restricted to just an Awakening deck. Like you have options, like you can control the board a bit with some burn, establish some presence with range, and then set up your Awakening. There's a lot that you can do with this deck, so in my opinion, the Awakening archetype does bring out, or at least does take our top spot for the System Meta Monthly. Again, not only because of this deck, not only because of the red yellow, but because of how much we've seen the other variant, the purple Warlock, kind of take shape. And hell, I think even here or there, maybe once or twice, I've seen the Pirate Warlock try to sneak its way in there, although not as successful. But again, it does show you the fact that people are moving towards Awakening because they do kind of see that as just a dominating deck and one to kind of go to. But with that being said, we'll see how long that kind of lasts for now, because once people start to figure out how you take down Awakening decks, that'll obviously transition into gameplay. But overall, Awakening as of now will stay at our number one spot for this edition of Meta Monthly. And with that being said, what's going to do it for this edition of Meta Monthly. I did kind of try and shake things up a little bit by throwing maybe some more gameplay from Cards TV, rather than just looking at a deck list for a while. If you guys want me to return to that old format, though, let me know down in the comments. And remember, these are, of course, just my opinions regarding the meta. I know some of you might disagree, some might agree with some points, but not others. I totally understand that, and that is fine. So let me know if you guys have different opinions or thoughts down in the comments section below. And yeah, tell me what you think, because I am certainly curious. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so I kind of want to hear from you guys if you are thinking maybe the same thing as me, maybe not. Again, leave those all in the comment section down below. But if you haven't done so already, I'm still kind of figuring out my lines, even though I've been doing this for how many years. Be sure to leave your not only I mentioned comments. See, this is what I'm talking about. Be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Share if you didn't, of course, subscribe if you haven't done so already. So your support the channel by clicking that subscribe button at no additional cost to you. And maybe smack that notification bell. I try to do a little, I don't know, maybe. I feel like I should incorporate more of the notification bell stuff. But, you know, that's just me. Anyway, yeah, that's going to do it for me for now. So, until next time, guys, stay gaming.